Hey folks, so we are finally doing this long-awaited Hannah Arendt Lecture 2 on the Eichmann and Jerusalem reports. So to revisit from last time, our main concept here is still this notion of the banality of evil, right? And we talked a bit last time about how the notion of evil is modified by the notion of banality, right? Because they seem banality implies a kind of boring, unoriginal, cliche, everyday commonness, right? And when we think of evil, we usually don't think of any of those things, right? We usually tend to think that the notion almost looks like contradiction. I mean, evil is a lot of things, but boring is not usually one of them, right? But the reason she's setting up this notion, right, is she's talking about how evil can become sewn into the fabric of this everyday life that we find ourselves situated in, right? The way that inhumane acts have a tendency to become normalized, right? Especially insofar as these acts get, sort of woven into institutions, or they become ritualized or routines, right? And again, this is not to say that everyday life itself is evil, right? That somehow or other, the concept of boringness already implies evil. It just is meant to show how evil can sort of operate in plain sight in this way, right? And that we're far less likely also to sort of reflect on and consider the negative moral consequences of our actions when those actions do become routine, right? You don't think about routine actions as much as you think about novel ones, right? You don't reflect much on routine actions, right? They become habits, and habits, sort of by definition, are things that don't require that level of attention, right? So take you to, I mean, this is such a bad example, right? But hopefully, I bring this example up to sort of just to give you something to sink your teeth into if you're confused, but should in no way be equivocated with like the Adolf Eichmann trial, right? But a bad example of the banality of evil is something like the movie Monsters Incorporated, right? Where these characters, they have a job, and it's scaring children, right? And of course, this job is sort of they're in like a kid scaring factory, right? And this factory, provides like power for the city. I don't know when's the last time you've seen this movie, right? But this immoral behavior of child scaring, you can take that as a sort of baseline, not a nice thing to do. It becomes an everyday task, and right, the people, the monsters who scare the kids, they compete with each other. They try to be better at it. They take pride in being good at it, right? In the same way that Eichmann also took pride in his work, right? So I just want to bring this up as an illustration of the concept, while also saying you can't actually compare, Monsters Inc. with the Holocaust. That's a terrible equivocation, but think of it as like a heuristic example, right? Because we are talking about the figure of Adolf Eichmann, and that's who Arendt is talking about, and that's why she's sort of devising this concept. Because Adolf Eichmann is one of those guys who, if you talk about, pulling a trigger, he never actually killed anyone, right? But at the same time, is responsible for orchestrating the Holocaust, right? Is responsible for being one of the high-ranking leaders who turned the prison camps into death camps, right? So on that level, he's responsible for everything. And of course, he contends that right, he did this as a bureaucrat, or an administrator, not a soldier, right? And the interesting thing about this guy is that he pleads his case with the expectation that, look, if he just tells the jury his side of the story, they're going to get it, right? Or they're going to understand, right? They're going to understand why he was actually innocent, or he wasn't actually or really responsible for these things, right? He was just doing his job. And, as he always hastens to remind us, he was really good at it, right? He was really good at his job. And even has the nerve to tell us, as we mentioned last time, that, maybe if he had been in charge, none of this would have happened. Of course, it's too late for that. One of the important concepts I want to add to the banality of evil that I kind of want to focus on this time is the notion of guilt, right? Where guilt isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? Or it's not wrong to feel guilty, right? But it does get tricky, doesn't it? Or perhaps the way to put it is that guilt is not always, but is often. Well, okay. Guilt is often involved in ethical behavior, one might say. Not always, but often. But just feeling guilt is not the same as ethical behavior itself, right? And it's precisely because guilt is a kind of nostalgic and narcissistic emotion. And we got to work through what both of those things mean. In what way it is nostalgic and in which way it is narcissistic. Just to say it's nostalgic insofar as it dwells on the past, right? It dwells on the deed. It dwells on the event. It dwells on the source of guilt, right? And seeks forgiveness therein. Is a possible tendency of guilt. In the same way that guilt has a tendency to become narcissistic, right? Insofar as it doesn't focus primarily on the harm, it focuses on you, right? It focuses on you and your feelings about the harm that you committed, right? And of course, some degree of focus on yourself and your actions and reflection on your actions is sort of perhaps a necessary condition for anything that we might want to call moral behavior. But at the same time, guilt has a tendency to turn some harm that you've committed and make that harm about you rather than about the other or the one that you've harmed or the thing that you've harmed, right? So when we talk about guilt as nostalgia, right, nostalgia is a dangerous concept, right? Nostalgia always sort of dwells on a distorted image of the past, Talk about, I don't know what your generation talks about, but people my age, we all always talk about and romanticize the 90s. And, the 90s wasn't actually that great. Like, when we talk about how much we like the 90s, we really mean that we liked being children, right? In a sort of straightforwardly Bavarian sense, right? Like, we talk about the 90s as if it's this sort of Helicon era, but when in fact it's really just sort of too entangled with our feelings about childhood, right? And so we get a sort of distorted image of the past. And I think that happens to almost every era in which a group of people grows up. They have a tendency to look back on that as like, well, that wasn't that. If only things could go back to like they were back then, right? But the way that you think that they were is completely distorted by a sort of memory laced with nostalgia, right? And of course, nostalgia doesn't it's not necessarily always about a positive lingering on the past, right? There can be a kind of nostalgia that's involved in some event that you can't overcome, right? Nostalgia makes it, whether it's good or bad, nostalgia does make it difficult to transcend or move beyond this past that you linger on, right? And that's why we say that guilt is nostalgic, right? Is that the sort of rumination that comes with guilt kind of hopes, in a way that's absolutely impossible, to amend a deed or an event which has already transpired. And of course, there's no way to, change the past. The only thing we have control over is the present and the future. But, guilt can sort of lead us to avoid this rectification and sort of dwell on the past, if you understand what I mean there. Which is why we also say that guilt is narcissistic. Or it can be, right? As we said before, guilt can certainly be an ethically valuable emotion, right? But the problem is that it has a tendency to focus on the self rather than the other, especially when the other is the one who has been harmed, right? Right, guilt seeks forgiveness, right? And sometimes that's good, right? Because sometimes it motivates a rectification that will allow one to be forgiven, right? But there's also a sense in which, just focusing on forgiveness isn't necessarily enough to count as moral behavior, right? If you look at the cartoon on the right, which is from an Instagram account, we see the sort of paradigmatic case of the narcissistic guilt, right? I'm sad that I made you sad, so make me feel less sad about making you sad. Right? It's not actually seeking rectification for making you sad. It's looking to ameliorate your feelings of guilt about the harm that you committed, rather than seeking to reconcile the harm itself. Right? I mean, I saw this a lot when, I used to teach elementary school, and, some kid was acting up, and you send them out in the hallway, and you go out and you talk to them. They put on the waterworks, right? They always start crying while you're trying to scold them, right? And as soon as you're sort of done, the kid will be crying, and you'll be like, okay, just like, don't do it again. And the moment that kid has been forgiven, right, the tears stop, and they just walk back in the room and start playing with their friends again. It's like, and you can't help but feel like you got played a little bit, right? It's like, no, you didn't learn anything. You were just crying until we got to the point where I could tell you, okay, I'm not mad anymore. You can stop crying. And now your guilt feelings are gone, right? So you can see how it's like, well, did the kid have an ethical reaction? Probably not. They just got to ameliorate their bad feelings about the bad thing they did. Right? Hence why we say that guilt has a tendency to be narcissistic, right? Right, if it seeks a forgiveness that's bound up with just a desire to escape from the bad feelings that come with guilt, or having committed a harm, right? Do something bad, you feel bad about it, but guilt has a tendency to focus more on your bad feelings about the bad thing you did than actually working to amend that harm. Which is exactly what Arendt is talking about on page 251. Sort of towards the bottom of page 251, which I think is a really important section, where she's talking about another philosopher, Martin Buber's take on the execution of Eichmann. Right, because Buber thinks it's going to be a mistake to execute Eichmann, precisely because this is 20 years after the Nuremberg trials. Like, people are wondering, how much apologizing is this going to take, or like how long is it going to take to atone for the sins of a nation, right? And Buber is worried that the execution of Eichmann might sort of alleviate those feelings of guilt in a way that's sort of, his execution might just serve as a sort of like symbolic event that alleviates the guilt of a nation, right? Which is actually also, and Arendt is pointing this out here, it's she's saying Buber didn't realize how the degree to which Eichmann sort of was on the same page to a certain extent, right? Where Eichmann did want his hanging to be public, right? Precisely because he sort of wanted to Eichmann, this is the weird thing, right? Is that like even though he thought the truth really was on his side, once it became clear that his execution was sort of going to take place, he struck up this sort of like idea that like, well, I should die a noble death, like I should die to sort of to cleanse the sins of the German youth, right? Who are sort of suffering under the sins of their fathers or whatever, right? Right, to lift the burden of guilt from the German shoulders of German youngsters, right? And Arendt is sort of agreeing with Buber to an extent. Where she's pointing out that the fact that that Eichmann's execution shouldn't have been taken that way, or shouldn't be taken that way, because this kind of guilt and this sort of rumination on guilt and the sort of like symbolic alleviation of guilt through the punishment of guilty parties, or ostensibly guilty parties, doesn't help anybody, right? When Arendt writes that like those young German men and women who every once in a while, on the occasion of the Diary of Anne Frank hubbub and of the Eichmann trial, treat us who hysterical outbreaks of guilt feelings, are not staggering under the burden of the past and their father's guilt. Rather, they are trying to escape from the pressure of the very present and actual problems into a cheap sentimentality, right? I mean, what she's saying is like, look, your guilt doesn't help anybody, right? There are still real problems. There are still things to atone for here, and you're just feeling bad about them does nothing to alleviate those actual real problems which resulted from the things that you're feeling guilty about. You're just trying to escape from your bad feelings through these sort of displays of guilt that don't benefit anyone except for the one who feels guilty. And they certainly don't benefit anyone who is harmed, right? I mean, this is a lot like white guilt also, right? White guilt doesn't actually help anybody. Justice helps people. Guilt just sort of, especially displays of guilt, only sort of benefit the one who feels guilty. So if you could sort of wrap your head around that, I mean, there's a sort of, you can see how guilt is a double-edged sword here. And that's what she's trying to point out, that certainly guilt can be involved in moral actions, but it can also be involved in the frustration of moral action. It can sort of do nothing more than sort of alleviate the guilt of one who feels guilty, if you understand. She moves on to talk about Eichmann's last statement, right? And I want you to look back at this section and really read what's going on there, because Arendt's not pulling any punches here. That his sort of final moments before his execution, she's saying, are really just as laced in cliches and banality as the life that he lived, and the very life that made him a Nazi, right? She ends by saying that it was in those last minutes he was summing up the lesson that this long course of human wickedness had taught us. The lesson of the fearsome, word and thought-defying banality of evil, right? The way that his sort of oratory at the end is just, he doesn't say anything. It's sort of laced in cliches, right? He's just sort of saying the things that he thinks that a final statement should look like. Even in his final moments, he's just clinging to cliches, and he hasn't said anything original, right? He's just, right? You can see this. This is evident in his phrase here, the sort of like, we shall meet again, and like, long live Germany, and all that stuff. Like, it's boring. And he thinks he's doing great because he's doing the things that one should do and one should say when they're giving a sort of closing statement. Even with his last chance to say something, he didn't say anything. He just stuck to cliches. And Arendt is sort of saying, like, yeah, in an ironic sense, that does sum up his life. And that sums up the, not just Eichmann's life, but the sort of, the life of fascism, right? The sort of, this sums up the spirit of fascism in a certain way, where it's like, you're not thinking about what it means to give a closing statement. You're relying on cliches to help you understand what it means to give a good one, right? In the same way that, you weren't, when you were doing these terrible things, you weren't really doing them, you were just doing your job. And you were worried about what it means to do your job well, not what doing your job well entails ethically, right? So she's trying to sort of, this is on page 252, and I would recommend you sort of go back and figure out the sort of picture that she's painting there, because it's very important. And it does really sum up this notion of the banality of evil that she's trying to depict. So, that's sort of, there's a lot going on in this book. There's a lot to talk about. And I wish we could have spent more time with it, but I'm trying to sort of extract a few points to let sit with you. And, I don't know. A broader point you can make, and something that people have written about quite a lot, is that, I don't know if this is true about human beings in general, but certainly in terms of sort of Western legal institutions, maybe especially, we have a really easy time sort of blaming individuals, right? And we have a sort of very robust system for figuring out how to hold individuals accountable for things. We're not very good at figuring out how to hold groups accountable. We're not very good at figuring out how to hold institutions accountable, responsible. We're not good at sort of figuring out how to punish collectives, right? And these questions of collective responsibility and how to deal with them were major questions that Arendt is struggling with here, right? And that it's not just Arendt's problem. It was sort of a question on everyone's mind. And I can't claim, I don't think she wants to give us a clean-cut, definitive answer about how to do that. I certainly don't either. I mean, if you're interested in the question, there's no shortage of things written about it, but it's quite a lot of what's motivating what has been going on here.